Good afternoon, evening, wherever you are. It's me again. It's Paul Woodadge. It's WW2 TV, and we have finally got Iwo Jima week off and running after yesterday's slightly false start. But tonight we are talking about where Iwo Jima sits in the grand scheme of the Pacific campaign, and there is literally no one better I could have brought on to talk about this. Ian W. Toll has written a trilogy of outstanding books about the Pacific theatre that particularly focus on the naval and the air aspects as well as the ground aspects and cover it all in very thorough manner. So good evening and welcome to the show, Ian. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
So I'm going to start by talking about Iwo Jima in terms of where it sits in my British kind of memory, because, you know, I'll be honest, a lot of my knowledge of Iwo Jima is the attack on the island itself. It's the flag raising, it's the volcanic sand, it's the Marines, it's flamethrowers, it's about the land battle on the island itself. And I'm guessing that quite a lot of the people watching, that is also how they perceive Iwo Jima. But Iwo Jima sits, of course, in a much larger Pacific campaign that lasts from 1941 up to 1945. So you've covered all those major campaigns. So we're going to try and explain, with your help, where it sits and what the other options could have been in terms of directions for Allied forces. I'll bring up a couple of maps, folks, later on so you understand what we're doing. But just before we get to grips with it, I'm just going to show you the quick promo and remind you that we have actually a sponsor for us this week. So I'm going to play that little promo, then I'll get back to Ian.
Iwo Jima Week on WW2 TV is sponsored by battlemaps.us. They produce high-quality reproductions of maps from the 13th century right up to the Second World War, including maps of Iwo Jima.
So there we are. So, Ian, Iwo Jima. Let's begin. Where do we want to start with this? I mean, we can go back to the Japanese expansion in 1942. So for those watching, I'm going to hand over to Ian in a second. We've got Australia at the bottom there, China and Japan at the top. The Iwo Jima sits directly south of Japan. And then you've got the Solomon Islands over here, Marshall Islands over here, the Philippines over here. And then you've got this massive, and I can't overestimate, a massive Great Ocean that makes the distances of everything just mind-blowing. You know, for me as an ETO guy, you know, I can drive to Germany in a day from here. The Pacific, the distances are just incredible. And that in and itself made everything that much tougher because of those distances, all the logistics of getting everything. So Ian, I'm going to have you start by, where does Iwo Jima come in the grand scheme of things?
Well, we took Iwo Jima in February 1945, so that's about 6 months before the end of the war. But just to back up for a moment, I think to begin this discussion, I think one thing that we should make a mental adjustment when we move from the ETO to the Pacific. In this respect, the war in Europe was a ground campaign and an air war in which naval operations played an important supporting role. And that was true in the Normandy invasion. It was true in the Mediterranean operations as well. So naval operations play a supporting role for a conflict that was primarily a very large ground conflict and an air war. When we move to the Pacific, this is the adjustment that you need to make at the outset. This was a naval war and an air war in which ground operations played a supporting role. So as Americans in particular, we're a continental country, and it's very natural to think of war first as war on land. And so that's part of the reason that battles, Iwo Jima first among them, loom very, very large in the kind of collective historical memory, the popular historical memory of the Second World War in the Pacific. In fact, when you look at the island fights throughout the Pacific, the Solomons, the Guadalcanal, the heart of the Pacific, in the Tarawa and the Gilbert Islands and the Marshall Islands, the Mariana Islands, all of them, every time we took an island, we took it because we needed it as an air base or as a naval base, a base for the logistics, the supporting operations to move overwhelming military force toward Japan, where eventually we would overpower Japan if necessary by invading Japan and therefore win the war. So these islands had no value really in themselves, and taking an island was essentially a waste of time and blood and treasure unless it fit into the overall scheme of moving our naval forces and our air forces across these tremendous distances in this largest of all oceans. So that's just to begin. Think of the island operations as sort of a specialized element of this larger campaign. We would send the Marines. The Marines were really a specialized amphibious force. They were a shock force, trained to do one thing overall, and that is to go in and take a beachhead in an amphibious invasion. Later, you could bring the Army in as a garrison force. And once again, to take that island, you took it for the purpose of building an air base there. Or building a naval base, or both, in which the fleet and the air forces could then sort of gather their strength and prepare for the next westward push toward the Japanese home island. So that's the overall pattern of the Pacific War. And you see there we had these double campaign, this kind of two parallel counteroffensives against the Japanese, starting in the South Pacific in the Solomons in mid-1942, and then going up that chain of islands through the Admiralties, the Bismarcks, along the north coast of New Guinea, and then eventually terminating with MacArthur's return to the Philippines. The Navy and the Marines then, over MacArthur's fervent opposition, opened up a second counteroffensive in the Central Pacific, beginning in the Gilbert Islands. And here we're talking about the Gilbert Islands and the Marshall Islands. What these are very, very isolated Pacific atolls. And an atoll is a remnant of a prehistoric volcano. Essentially, it's a ring of very narrow islands enclosing a very large lagoon. That's what an atoll is. There's very little landmass there, and often these islands are essentially sand spits that don't rise more than 10 or 15 feet above sea level. So there's not much there. I mean, these are both very small and among the most remote places on planet Earth. So we took the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. We took several of the Marshall Islands further north and west in January and February 1944. And then we took the Mariana Islands, reclaiming Guam, which had been a U.S. territory, as well as the islands of Saipan and Tinian in June and July 1944. By taking those islands, we essentially sort of opened up the end game in the Pacific. The Japanese, at least the high command, understood that this was essentially an irreversible sort of strategic defeat. We had these islands that were on their southern doorstep, about 1,500 miles from their homeland. From there, we could harry their sea communications, cut their economic lifeline to the South Pacific, where their oil supply was. And then establish large air bases from which the newly deployed B-29 Superfortress, this long-range heavy bomber, would be able to hit Tokyo and the other major industrialized regions of the heart of Japan, the Kanto Plain. So those events in mid-1944 essentially brought us to the last stage of the Pacific War, in which both sides, at least at the upper echelons of the governments on both sides, understood that Japan had lost this war. And the only question really remaining was, would they surrender and allow an occupation force to come ashore peacefully, or were we going to have to take that island through a bloody invasion, which of course would have been terrible both for the Japanese and the Allies. So the decision to take Iwo Jima, which as you pointed out, Paul, is between the Mariana Islands and Japan. What's important about Iwo Jima, it's a small island, 8 square miles. It's essentially a lump of volcanic sulfur. What was important about it was its location. It was almost directly on the flight line between the Marianas and Tokyo, and about halfway between them, I think about 700 miles north of Saipan, 750 miles south of Tokyo, almost directly on the flight line. And it is of the islands in that region, there's a few others, small islands. It was the only one that had terrain that was suitable for an air base or an airstrip big enough to accommodate the B-29, the big bombers. And so very quickly after we took the Marianas in June, July 1944, it became apparent that Iwo Jima was like a thorn in our side because the Japanese could use it as essentially an air staging base to attack the Mariana Islands. And they steadily launched fighter and bomber attacks from Iwo Jima in the months after we took those islands. And also because we actually wanted that interim airstrip in order to support our B-29 operations, essentially as a place. The B-29s would fly over 1,500 miles, trackless ocean, burning fuel, drop their bombs. And then at that point, there was no friendly air base within 1,500 miles. They had to turn around and fly all the way back. This is a round trip of flight, the distance of flying New York to LA. And this is in a World War II airplane. So to have another airstrip that was a little bit closer was going to make a tremendous difference in terms of cutting B-29 loss rates and also in allowing these planes to carry a larger bomb load, which was a critical consideration. So for those reasons, it became clear that we needed Iwo Jima. I'm conscious that I've been going on at some length here, so I want to pause and.
Well, I'm going to interject and say, so the first thing I wanted to reiterate to everyone watching is this idea of the importance of the air war, the B-29s, because again, confessing my English knowledge of this campaign, it's something I have been overlooking over the years, just that the importance of getting the bombers to Japan. I've been looking at the islands in that more island hopping ground, because as you say, that's how we perceive it. And I'm an ETO guy, and I'm ashamedly an ETO guy. The other thing I talked about this when we did our pre-chat yesterday is we're looking at this map now. We can see the dates of when each island was taken, and we can look at this sort of progression across the Pacific there. The thing that strikes me as an ETO guy, and I do realize a lot of people watching this are more familiar with the ETO than perhaps they are the Pacific Theater, is how difficult it is in advance of these operations to predict this time scale of when you're going to get to certain places. Because are we going to take an island, an atoll in a week, or is it going to take us 2 months? And we don't know in advance of this until we get there how it's going to be. And you have the Guadalcanals, and as an example, which, the early one where everything just bogged down and got very problematic, and we had Brian Dimitrovic come on and talk about Guadalcanal last year. Then you've got other islands we can nip over in a few days. So I can imagine the commanders having this difficulty in predicting at what point we're going to be at the position to better move our chess pieces closer to Japan. And that therefore means you've got to have commanders who have got the foresight to predict things that are essentially unpredictable. And again, bringing it back to the ETO, once we have got that massive great invasion force in the United Kingdom, of which we have a lot of it there by 42, and then by 43, 44, we've got loads of it there. It's just a matter of hopping it across the channel. And it's a very different prospect. The situation isn't going to change dramatically. The Germans might move a few divisions around. We might get a bit more advantage here or there, but the chess pieces aren't going to change. With the Pacific, as you'll explain later on, Ian, you can have a massive, great naval engagement. Suddenly, a naval force you're expecting to encounter has now been removed from the chessboard. And that I find fascinating, how constantly changing the situation is. So I think maybe time to bring in some of the big players. You mentioned MacArthur earlier, but I think we've got to bring Nimitz in, and also their opposing strategies for how they were going to handle the Pacific campaign. So if you could kind of run through how they are involved in this, please. Right.
So as you know, as many of your viewers will know, the United States made this controversial decision in the first stages of the war in April 1942, that we were going to set up the command structure in Europe essentially by dividing the theater, and we divided it right along the equator. Through in the South Pacific, drew a vertical line essentially between the Solomons and New Caledonia. So this is sort of between New Zealand and Australia. So everything west of that line in the South Pacific, we called the Southwest Pacific area, and that was MacArthur's domain. MacArthur was placed in charge of it. He was the theater commander. So that's essentially the Philippines, Australia, New Guinea, and those island groups, including most of the Solomons, the Admiralties, the Bismarcks, all essentially belonged to MacArthur. He reigned there as the theater commander. And then you had the Navy in charge of the northern part of the Pacific. And that was Chester Nimitz, who was the theater commander there. So you had this awkward kind of decision to, make the Solomon-like decision to divide the Pacific and not to have one single theater commander in charge of the whole show, as Eisenhower was in the ETO. And of course, that set up a natural rivalry. You already had the natural service rivalry between the Army and the Navy. And you had Nimitz, who was a retiring figure. He was really an organization man, someone you never would have heard his name if we hadn't had a Second World War, who was sort of in the right place at the right time, was thrust into this important position of, being the theater commander. His command area took in about a fifth of the Earth's surface. It was absolutely enormous. And he was also the commander of the Pacific Fleet, which was by far the largest fleet ever assembled in history, the largest, most powerful naval force we have ever seen, probably will ever see, at least in the terms of its size, number of ships. So MacArthur was really a singular figure. His fame, very early in the war, he became very, very famous globally, really, but in the United States in particular. And this was partly just due to the kind of the way the early news was reported. He was at the head of this beleaguered army in the Philippines. We had little hope of supporting him or even evacuating his army. And his very adept press section essentially was able to kind of promote him to the point where, and I cannot emphasize this, it would be very difficult to exaggerate the degree to which MacArthur became a very, very famous, beloved sort of figure, really on a par with FDR himself. There was no one else in the military that was like him in terms of the shadow that he cast across American popular culture, society, and politics. And politics, I emphasize that because he was politically conservative, closely aligned with the Republican Party. So there's a political element to a lot of these decisions. Now, MacArthur, of course, had been in the Philippines. FDR had ordered him to leave the Philippines under cover of darkness. He'd been evacuated to Australia, placed in charge of that counteroffensive in the South Pacific. And so overall, his view was, we have to return to the Philippines and liberate the Philippines and liberate my captive army there. And we need to do that before we do anything else.
And just to interject, I mean, the Philippines for him is this strange, paradoxical Achilles heel, and yet it's also what makes his fame. It's both a burden and it's an obsession. It's he had a home there, his family was there, he had this whole long connection there. Was his son born there?
His father had been there. Yes, I believe his son was born there. He had a son.
He's blinkered. He's obsessed, which can be both a positive and a negative. And yet you've got someone like Nimitz, and we'll bring in Spruance later on, who are perhaps more focused on a campaign to that's the best way to defeat the Japanese. Whereas MacArthur is going to have to go through the Philippines because he's got this obsession. He's made that promise that I will be back. The water, the sea, the whole thing is all bound up in everything that has made him popular. That you're saying that status he had, and it's interesting that he's not perhaps seen the same way these days by historians and the public, but in the time of the war, as you said, his status was no one came close. I mean, Eisenhower couldn't come close, Patton didn't come close, no one came close.
No one was in the same league in terms of the popularity or stature or political influence, and that is an important factor. And as you say, he had this monomaniacal focus on going back to the Philippines. Understandable, really, when you look at the circumstances at the beginning of the war, being essentially sort of left stranded, suddenly encountering this this enemy, the Japanese, who proved to be far more formidable than anyone had expected, really surprising everyone, especially with the capabilities of their air power and the speed with which their naval amphibious forces could move. Suddenly being subjected to an invasion, a very effective invasion in which his army, his American and Filipino army, was essentially overwhelmed very quickly and trapped on Bataan in a doomed siege. And so it was natural for him to want to go back and rectify that and to recapture those islands. But I think that was his monomaniacal focus. And of course, for the military planners in Washington, and for the Navy and the planners in Pearl Harbor, there was a reasonable point to be made here to say, listen, our objective here is to defeat Japan. If we defeat Japan, we're going to regain the Philippines as a matter of course. And so recapturing the Philippines is not the ultimate objective here. The ultimate objective is bringing this war to a close as quickly and with as little a cost as possible. And if that means going directly across the northern Pacific and closing the ring around the Japanese home islands more rapidly, we should do that. And so that became the argument, the kind of meta argument in the Pacific is, do we prioritize this? We have these two parallel offensives that we've discussed. Do we prioritize the Central Pacific campaign and a strategy of, by 1944, essentially bringing pressure directly to bear on the Japanese home islands and taking territory south of Japan that we can then use as a springboard for an invasion if necessary? Or should we do, as MacArthur is saying we should do, first of all, we have an obligation to recapture the Philippines. Secondly, he argued using conventional and frankly outdated ideas of how an amphibious advance should occur. He argued that the island-dominated geography, you see it there on the map, you have bigger islands closer together in southern Oceania. And he said that sort of geography was more suitable to an amphibious campaign because you could use land-based air power, for example, to cover each advance. Whereas in the North Pacific, where you have smaller islands, Central and North Pacific, you have small islands separated by thousands of miles. The only way then to take those islands is to leap across 1,000 miles of sea and to use carrier air power as your air cover rather than land-based air power.
And when you put it like that, that makes a lot of sense. And I'd also, just to interject again, sorry, but you've also got MacArthur understands the importance of propaganda and the PR as well. Yes, and I suppose if you go the Philippines way, you will along the way get your liberations. You'll get your grateful civilians. You'll get people waving flags. You'll get people being, thank you very much for saving our lives, which you're not going to get going through the Mariana and the Iwo Jima because of the lack of civilian population there effectively. So right. I suppose in terms of the way the folks back home, and if you're looking at the bigger picture and people working harder, and Rosie the Riveter working a bit harder in the production lines, and people doing the war bonds drives and the paper runs, all that kind of stuff, I can see that a campaign where we have liberated this, we've liberated Guam, we've liberated Luzon, we've liberated this, is going to have a sort of collateral effect beyond just the strategy of defeating Japan. Whereas the defeating Japan going the Central Pacific is just purely military. It's purely objective, target, eliminate the enemy. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, it is. To put an even finer point on it, since we're talking about the larger context here, it's often forgotten that MacArthur essentially challenged FDR implicitly by threatening to run for president in 1944. And this was, MacArthur never acknowledged this publicly, but he was in touch with leading Republicans in the United States at the beginning of 1944. And you had in the American press extensive speculation that MacArthur was going to return to the United States and campaign full-time for the nomination, and that would secure the Republican nomination. And then you've got a situation where one of your leading generals is running against your president, your incumbent president, in a contested campaign at the height of the Second World War. And so that scenario seemed very real. Eventually, MacArthur, of course, did not do that. But these arguments are taking place at the same time that he is threatening to do this. And so there really is a dimension here of politics involved in these decisions. So the Navy, meanwhile, the situation with the Navy is a little bit more complex because the planners, the planning bodies, the Joint Chiefs of Staff planning organization, which is based in Washington, is coming to the conclusion that the way to end the Pacific War is to get China involved. And what they really want to do is they want to take the island of Formosa, Taiwan, and then they want to establish a beachhead on mainland China. And they want to use that beachhead as a way to sort of throw a lifeline to Chiang Kai-shek and to turn the situation in China around. So this would involve a much larger degree of direct U.S. involvement in the war on the Asian mainland. And when I say American, I'm sure we would be dragging our allies in there as well. So you'd have the British and Commonwealth allies involved. And, you can just imagine what a potential scale of that kind of an operation would be in mainland China. This is what the Joint Chiefs wanted to do. And of course, the Joint Chiefs are the top layer of the military command hierarchy. And so their view matters a lot. And Admiral King, who was the Chief of Naval Operations, the senior ranking naval officer in the service at that time, championed really quite ardently this idea that we should take Formosa. We should bypass the Philippines, or most of the Philippines, the main island of Luzon, certainly bypass that, take Formosa, establish this lifeline to Chiang Kai-shek, this beachhead on the coast of China, involving us in the war in China, then preserving the possibility of using China's bottomless manpower reserves, possibly to then invade Japan. So the idea was you would use large numbers of Chinese troops to invade Japan. Now, within the Navy, this idea became controversial to the point where many of the key figures in the Pacific under Nimitz were saying, we don't want to do this. We have studied this operation to take Formosa, and we do not like it. And the more we study it, the less we like it. And eventually that turned into outright opposition. And so I'll focus on one figure in particular, that's Raymond Spruance. He was the fleet commander in the Pacific, the top seagoing naval commander in the Pacific, who had previously served as Nimitz's chief of staff, who was personally and professionally very close to Nimitz, and was one of the most respected figures in the U.S. Navy at that time. And he strenuously argued against this invasion of Formosa and said, instead, what we should do is take a more direct route toward Japan by taking Iwo Jima and Okinawa in that order. And so this became the alternative. And of course, eventually Spruance and the others who supported this point of view won that argument. And the idea then was, let's let MacArthur have his way in the Philippines, send him back, let him liberate the Philippines and Luzon, and we will take the extra time that we need to build up our naval and amphibious and air forces so that we can tackle Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And so it was really at the end of September 1944 that the Joint Chiefs approved this course of action and fixed the sequence of major operations for the last year of the Pacific War in that order. So it'd be the island of Luzon, which is, of course, where Manila is, the main northern island of the Philippines. Originally, that was to be December. It was moved to January, then Iwo Jima in February, and then Okinawa in April. And those were the three major amphibious operations in the last year of the war.
But the key thing from our conversation, our pre-conversation, is that you believe that Spruance would have liked to have pushed this all earlier, because we're talking today 75 years on from the naval bombardment of Iwo Jima. The landings, start, D-Day is tomorrow, 75 years on. But right now, it's all the naval operations, the air operations going on. And we will come to the Japanese defense of Iwo Jima, although we'll be covering that in our other shows tomorrow and the next day. But it was a tough fight. We know that it was 30 days, 18 kilometers of tunnels there. Kurabayashi had to set up an incredible line of defenses there that cost an incredible amount of American lives, Marines and other personnel killed there. and you've established that Spruance had done this deal. MacArthur gets his bit. It's a compromise, I suppose. It's a compromise. They're not going to do the Chinese thing, but there could have been an attack on Iwo Jima earlier. That's a point you kind of wanted to bring across, isn't it? So how would that have happened?
Yeah, so we, as we were saying, we took the Marianas, Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, and this is in June and July 1944, and then immediately had to confront this issue of Iwo Jima, which is 700 miles north of Saipan, and is the sort of the way station for air reinforcements coming from Japan. So the Japanese are sending their fighters and bombers south. They land on Iwo Jima, they refuel, and then they continue on to attack either the fleet off the Mariana Islands or ground targets on the islands themselves. And this is a kind of a constant irritant. The airstrikes aren't large enough to actually alter the outcome of our capturing the Marianas, but they are a constant irritant, and they become costly. And in fact, after the first B-29s are based on airfields in Saipan in particular, these very, very audacious raids, nighttime daylight raids by Japanese fighters and bombers coming in, often skimming in on the wave tops to come in under the radar umbrella, and attacking these B-29 bases on the ground. In one raid, for example, they destroyed 11 B-29 bombers on the ground. And I mean, these are big, expensive airplanes. So losing 11 of them in one raid, you can imagine that made a noise in Washington when that happened. And so what became the Air Force at the time was called the Army Air Forces. It was the air arm of the Army. It wasn't independent at that point. But the Air Force, as we call it today, brought a lot of pressure to bear on the Navy to do something about this situation. And then Hap Arnold, who was the Air Force senior officer, member of the Joint Chiefs, directly abdicated this attack on Iwo Jima as a result of this. And so that was a part of the context. Now, at the time that we took the Marianas, so in the summer of 1944, we had forces in the region. We had a fleet there. And, one of the sort of what ifs is, what if we had decided to take Iwo Jima right then or right there? The result would have been we would have taken it easily because the Japanese had not yet, they were in the process of building up their forces. Kurabayashi was already on the island, but they hadn't brought in large numbers of Army reinforcements yet. So the troop strength there was limited. More importantly, they had not yet begun to dig those extensive fortifications. And so they were not prepared in the way that they were 4 months later. And it's a regret, of course. They didn't have the benefit of hindsight at the time. But if they had moved more quickly to take Iwo Jima, they would have been able to do it at a much, much lower cost in American lives.
And did in your research for your books, did any of the people involved in this, Spruance or anybody else, comment on this either during the war or just after war? Did anyone admit this was possibly a missed opportunity, or did they all just kind of ignore it?
No, in fact, there was discussion of taking Iwo Jima earlier. There was a precedent for it as well. We had taken the atoll of Eniwetok in the Marshalls during the Marshall Islands campaign. That had not been one of the atolls that we had planned to take. It was the westernmost, so closest to Japan and to the Marianas. But once we went into the heart of the Marshalls and landed troops on several other atolls, including Kwajalein, the resistance had been unexpectedly light, and we'd been able to complete those invasions more quickly than we had anticipated. And it occurred to several commanders simultaneously. Many of them separately tried to take credit for this later, but it sort of seemed to occur to all of them simultaneously. Why don't we just grab Eniwetok? We've already got our fleet here. We've got sufficient reserve amphibious troops. Let's just go grab it right now. And they did that, and that ended up being vindicated. That was absolutely a significant thing to do because, as I say, that was the westernmost atoll, therefore closest to the theater of future operations. So if we'd done something like that, as I said, I think that would have in retrospect, that we would have seen that as the right thing to do. Now, this is where this dual theater issue and the politics around that come into play. In September 1944, we took the island of Peleliu and several other islands in the Caroline group, and you can see it there on the map. It's east of the Philippines, and we had essentially the decision to take those islands was connected to MacArthur's return to the Philippines. So the idea was to protect MacArthur's northern flank there as he returned to the Philippines. Peleliu was the largest airfield, Japanese airfield in that archipelago of islands. And that ended up being another terribly bloody island fight, a really awful battle. I mean, not a huge battle on the scale of what was happening around the world. But in many Marines who fought on different battlefields around the Pacific said Peleliu was absolutely the worst in terms of the fighting conditions. And after we had taken it, a lot of people scratched their heads and wondered, why did we have to take that island? What purpose did it serve? Really, we could have kept the Japanese airstrip there essentially neutralized by frequent bombing runs. And so that was probably the clearest example of all of the major island fights in the Pacific, where in retrospect, you would have preferred to bypass.
And you can kind of see it on that map there. I mean, we've turned backwards on us. We're going back to where we started. The arrows start going back south again. And you know, as you say there, had we just carried on going past it, isolate it, cut it off. I know there's that long. No one ever wants to leave an enemy behind them. It's you know, it goes against military logic, doesn't it, to some extent?
Yes.
But you know, you kind of look at it and go, yeah, well, that was maybe a waste of resources.
Right. And if you'd had one theater commander in the Pacific, one individual with responsibility for the whole theater, that would have been an easier decision to make. But you know, partly what you have here is you have this dynamic between the Navy and Nimitz and MacArthur, essentially a delicate negotiation, a fragile consensus here that is keeping everything in balance. And so to bypass Peleliu at that point might have aroused a protest from MacArthur. And as we say, MacArthur's protests were dangerous because they would resonate in the newspapers and in the halls of Congress because of his political influence. So all of that, I think, are factors that play into it. But if I could get into a time machine and go back and talk to Chester Nimitz, I would urge him to scratch that invasion of Peleliu and maybe take that those same troops and that same amphibious fleet and point it north and take Iwo Jima right then in September 1944. I think that would have been feasible.
Now, had they done it then, there would have been some air power in Iwo Jima because but not huge amounts, but there would have been air power, and the Japanese might have had more naval support. Am I right in thinking that?
Well, you know, I think you are right, although by that time, September 1944, the Japanese really are on their back heels. I mean, the idea that they would have been able to contest the landing with a naval force, I think, is far-fetched. They had just been absolutely, beaten, thrashed quite soundly at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. So their carrier air power was essentially in a very, very bad way at that point. The air power response, I'm sure, would have been stronger, no question. But we had established pretty clearly that we had air supremacy when we wanted it. We had sent our carrier task force to raid Iwo Jima 5 or 6 times just between the invasion of Saipan in June 1944 through the end of that summer. So there were a series of these carrier raids on Iwo Jima in which we essentially leveled, our planes leveled almost all structures standing above ground, destroyed hundreds of planes, most likely in the air and on the ground. Incidentally, our former president, George Herbert Walker Bush, was an Avenger pilot who was shot down in one of those raids. And he was shot down just off the island of Chuichi-jima, which is near Iwo Jima. And his air crewmen were captured and treated very, very poorly by the Japanese in a series of atrocious war crimes. This was all covered by James Bradley in his book Flyboys. But Bush parachuted into the ocean and was rescued by an American submarine, the Finback. So all of that happened as part of these operations. All of that is just to say, though, Paul, that I do think that it would have been, you would have seen a ferocious air response from the Japanese because you're taking territory so close to their homeland, and yet we had very clearly shown that we had the upper hand in those air battles. I don't think they would have been able to mount any sort of effective naval response at all, and so, of course, it's easy for me here sitting in my armchair to say that would have been easy. It would not have been easy. It would have been difficult, and doing it at the last minute opportunistically would have involved quite a bit of improvising. But Nimitz and the Navy in particular prided themselves on doing that, and as I say, they had done that before. None of my research has led me to think that would have been anything less than feasible, and would have led, you wouldn't have lost 6,000 killed in action in taking Iwo Jima in September 1944.
So let's recap a bit. So you're saying that a single commander, and we ought to mention Mountbatten, I guess, because Mountbatten's in charge over there's another commander involved in the theater as well. So that with the ETO there was that decision to put Eisenhower at the top, and with hindsight, it was a magnificent one. And my respect for Eisenhower never dims. I go in and out of liking of people like Montgomery and others, but Eisenhower just remains, as he's always been in my understanding, just right up there. So perhaps a single commander there to oversee and just make those decisions might have helped things out. But we get to the point where 75 years ago this week, there was actually an invasion on Iwo Jima. And as we know, it was very costly. And we will be covering that in our shows over the next couple of days. But as someone who's studied all of these Pacific Island campaigns, and whereas people like ourselves, we often only know just Iwo Jima, you said that at the top of the show, analyze Iwo Jima as how well have the US got amphibious landings by the time they get to Iwo Jima? Where's the learning curve at this point? Because you've done an awful lot of them by this point, marine landings, and as you say, sometimes some army landings as well. So where does Iwo Jima say? Was it our A game? Was it a B game? How did it go? And we've also got to talk about the Japanese defenses, and as we said, the 18 miles of tunnels and the bunkers and the pillboxes. But where does it sit?
Well, yeah, I mean, you'd have to say that the Americans had the game well in hand by then. I mean, we're getting toward the tail end of the war. It's February 1945. The only major amphibious invasion to follow at that point was Okinawa. So Iwo Jima was really the penultimate major amphibious operation of the Pacific War. And by that time, if you look at the command roster, Kelly Turner, Holland Smith, the sub-commanders, the division commanders, all of them were veterans of previous operations, and they had been together. Spruance at the top as Fifth Fleet Commander. This team had been doing this since the invasion of the Gilberts, which had been more than a year earlier. They'd done essentially the whole Central Pacific campaign together, this team. And at every level, you've got veterans down to the non-coms and the platoons, veterans of previous amphibious operations. The fleet was at the peak of its strength. All of the supporting technologies that you use to move the forces and the supporting weapons and supplies ashore were, really was light years ahead of where it had been even a year previous. So, when you take that into account, when you realize this force really was at the, peak of its efficiency, and an efficiency, knowledge, and experience that had been earned in previous bloody operations, it's all the more impressive from the Japanese point of view that they were able to resist as effectively as they did. When we landed on Iwo Jima, we first sent Spruance and Admiral Mark Mitcher and the carrier task forces went north to hit Tokyo and the airfields around Tokyo And this was the first time that you had a carrier raid on the Japanese home island. This occurred literally 2 days before the invasion of Iwo Jima. Incidentally, more than half of the fighter pilots in that task force, in that raid, were rookies who had never fought in combat before. They were right out of pilot training programs. We had rotated many of our carrier aviators out of service just because they were becoming exhausted because of these prolonged operations. And and those greenhorns, those rookie pilots, acquitted themselves like veterans, which was really a testament to just how effective the pilot training program was at that point. These pilots were being graduated into frontline service with some 500 or 600 hours of flight time already. They really knew what they were doing. And we went in there, and it was a very effective series of raids. The Japanese were totally surprised. We destroyed hundreds of planes on the ground. And by doing that, I think suppressed the Japanese air response to the invasion of Iwo Jima. And as a result, you really didn't have anything like the air response, for example, that we encountered in Okinawa just a couple months later. There were only a few attacks on the fleet offshore. The Saratoga was badly damaged. I think we lost an escort carrier. But again, nothing like what we had encountered either in the Philippines with the kamikazes or in Okinawa. And so that was a significant achievement. We talk about the larger context. Look at the naval operations around this invasion of Iwo Jima. That's an important part of the story. When the Marines set foot on this island, I believe there were something like 400 ships in the offing, including 8 battleships. 8 battleships essentially with their 14 and 16-inch guns acting as field artillery to support the Marines. And then, the cruisers, the destroyers, the gunboats, the amount of offshore firepower that the Marines were able to call down. And when I say they called down, they really did. You had the Marine fire coordinators who were able to establish a direct radio link with the ships offshore, give them coordinates, and call down, battleship and cruiser fire on positions just a few hundred yards away from where they were. So the supporting naval firepower offshore was a tremendous asset that the Americans had. And then, of course, they had almost total air superiority, as I say, with very few Japanese raids over the island. And something like a 3-to-1 advantage in the number of troops ashore. So when you look at all of those advantages, the fact that the Japanese were able to drag this fight out for 30 days and inflict more than 20,000 casualties, more than 6,000 Americans killed in action. If you take the sum of killed and wounded together, the number of American casualties were greater than the number of Japanese casualties. It's a pretty extraordinary accomplishment, and Kurabayashi has to be credited for what he was able to achieve. And the extent of the tunneling and the fortifications that they did was really something extraordinary to behold.
We had some comments on YouTube. Of course, by the time we get to Iwo Jima, it is as good as the Japanese homeland. They certainly perceive it as it's part of their own country, so they're going to fight harder. They're going
the Tokyo Defense District, which is just an organizational point, but within the Japanese Army, those islands were considered a part of the Tokyo Defense District had direct responsibility. Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about the Japanese plan, because in our pre-chat, it occurred to me that there is no single defensive action better planned than the one of the Japanese on Iwo Jima. I mean, I cannot think of anything else in World War II of a defensive action. Sure, they all got killed, bar a few who were captured, but they knew that going into it. But as you said, there 30 days to take the casualties they took of American lives and American wounded, and was absolutely extraordinary. Yeah. I want to ask you, in all your research, again, I'm an ETO guy. It's important. Our intelligence is very important. We haven't talked much about about intelligence and aerial reconnaissance photos and this. I mean, we're not getting any word from Iwo Jima, unlike we're getting word from France and the French resistance. We're not getting anything like that. But as it gets closer to February 45, does Nimitz, is he aware of the tunnels? Is he aware of the fortifications being dug there? What is there? And if there is there any possibility of changing the plan or amending the plan when we find this information out?
Well, the answer is yes. He was aware of the tunneling and the digging in, placing the artillery and the troops essentially underground. He was aware of that primarily because we had so much photography of Iwo Jima, so much reconnaissance photography, aerial photography, even submarine photography at beach level. We'd photographed every single square yard of that island many times over. And so the degree to which we were analyzing these defenses by observing them directly in that way prior to the landing was, again, like every other aspect of our operations in the Pacific, that aspect, that aerial photography had reached a point of scale and efficiency that was, certainly just unlike anything we had earlier in the war. And we were able to observe, literally by counting the number of tents on the ground. And then those tents were being shredded and destroyed in the daily bombing raids. And then, you would see the embrasures developing, but then you knew that you had a certain number of Japanese there. We did have radio intelligence, and by techniques like ration counting, for example, using radio decodes, we had a pretty good idea of that. You had a large garrison there. At least we thought. I think our estimates were there were at least 15,000. There were actually more like 22. But if you think 15,000 troops are on this very small island, 8 square mile island, and you can't see any of them in these photographs, then there's only one answer, and that is that they've dug in and they're underground. And so, I think it was understood. It was also not the first time we had encountered these tactics. In the fight on Peleliu, for example, there was very extensive use of underground networks, tunnels, and bunkers in the central highlands of that island.
Taro as well?
Yeah, Taro is, the geography of Taro is very different because it's a really tiny island, 1 square mile, and it's part of an atoll, so it's flat, completely flat. But yes, they had tunneled to the extent that they could, into those sandy islands at Tarawa. In the case of Iwo Jima, you have volcanic rock or tuff, as it's called. And it actually, as rock goes, it's fairly easy to dig in tuff. So that partly explains why that using mostly picks and shovels, they were able to dig such an enormous and extensive network. To this day, I believe those who visit Iwo Jima haven't discovered all of the underground chambers and tunnels that were there. So
Ben, come on, who's been to the island many times, who spent 52 hours there at one point going through the tunnels and said, there's just loads they haven't even touched on yet. But this goes back, sorry to interrupt you there, going back to had Spruance got his way and there'd been this bold move in September 44, another thing to consider, had they done that, is it might well have been a complete surprise to the Japanese. The point is, by February 1945, correct me if I'm wrong, Japanese know there's no way we can do anything except go to Iwo Jima. It is the next move. We can't conceal our movement. We've got to go to Iwo Jima to get there, and they know that. Is there anything else the Japanese could have done to either not defend Iwo Jima or try and defend it with they have virtually no fleet left? We say that the Americans haven't really any other option. They need it. They need the airfield. They need the B-29s to go there. Was there another course of action open to the Japanese, do you think?
Well, at the risk of sounding flip, the Japanese could have surrendered.
Well, yes, that's a very good point. Yeah.
It's we sort of laugh because if you know anything about the Japanese at that time, they were not going to surrender without taking quite a bit more punishment. But as I said earlier, as of July 1944, once they've lost the Mariana Islands, it's become clear, at least to top rank of their civilian and military leadership that they've lost this war. And the rational thing to do at that point would have been to seek an armistice, even if that involved allowing the occupation of their homeland. Now, of course, they really weren't able to do that because it would have essentially caused Japan to descend into civil war. You would have had an army coup d'etat. But, short of that, by early 1945, no, I really don't think that there was any action that the Japanese could have taken which would have altered the course of the war at that point. They were determined to try to inflict as much punishment on us as they could, to draw as much blood as they could, to try to raise the stakes, to raise the cost to us so that we would flinch before trying to invade the homeland. So at that point, Kuribayashi and his 22,000 troops were essentially expected to die to the last man without any hope at all of holding that island. Kuribayashi was told directly by General Tojo, we want you to do something similar to what was done on Attu. Attu was an Aleutian island, which was the first island in which the Japanese garrison had been completely wiped out, down to virtually the last man. And so that was an order, essentially. I want you to go to this island. I want you to fight and die to the last man. I want your entire garrison to be wiped out, but I want you to try to take as many of them with you as you can, and to try to slow them down. Buy us some time to improve our defenses in the homeland against what we now understand is going to be an invasion of our homeland. And by the way, the orders were the same essentially on Okinawa. And just 2 months later, the fight on Okinawa was even larger than the fight on Iwo Jima. It's a bigger island. We encountered some of the same tactical issues: the tunneling, the bunkers, the underground, the rocky terrain that was tough for us to get our tanks into action. And so the Japanese, by that point, with these islands, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, in all three cases, they changed their tactics. They stopped sending waves of infantry to shout banzai and to charge into well-entrenched Allied lines. So they abandoned those costly and futile tactics. They started digging into the ground. And in every case, they were essentially able to neutralize the American and Allied advantages in offshore naval firepower and air supremacy in the skies overhead. And inflict casualties approaching or exceeding 1 to 1. So, of course, all of that really just served to kill a lot of Japanese, to kill some Americans as well, and to delay somewhat the inevitable end of this war, which by that time was going to be total defeat for the Japanese. Well,
I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you. I have one final question for you, which could end up being a potential rabbit hole, but in the historiography of the Pacific Campaign, as someone who's written a trilogy of books and other books and lectured at the Naval College and what have you, where does Iwo Jima sit in that sort of historiography in our collective memory and to Americans today? I mean, is it all, as I said at the top of the show, it's all about flamethrowers and sand and flag raising, and will that change? Sort of second part of the question.
Yeah, well, I think Iwo Jima is really closely wrapped up in the identity of the Marine Corps. This was, it was essentially an all-Marine show, at least in terms of the ground fighting. The Army really didn't come in at all until after the most of the fighting was over as a garrison force. And of course, as we've said, the Marines lost more than 6,000 killed in action there, some 20,000 killed or wounded. And it also became, because of the famous flag raising on Suribachi, which you see there in that photograph in the background, that famous photograph taken by Joe Rosenthal became probably the single most iconic image of the Pacific War, the basis for the Iwo Jima Memorial at the Arlington Cemetery, and really became, I think, a sort of a symbol of the Marine Corps. So this battle really does serve as, the kind of founding. It's it's the equivalent of the shot heard round the world for the Marine Corps. Really, it's sort of Lexington and Concord for the Marines, and for that reason, I think it will always hold this kind of special place in our memory. And to be a little more cynical about it, the Marine Corps in 1945 was, politically speaking, attempting to secure its place in the future defense establishment. So everyone knew that the American Armed Forces were going to be reorganized after the war. The Marines were seeking an autonomous role, and the very aggressive use of publicity partly was aimed at achieving that. Of course, it did achieve that. And that partly also explains why this battle is so well remembered.
Yeah. But by 45, everybody's fighting for their future. The commandos, Merrill's Marauders, the variety of squadrons. And everyone knows that when peace comes, all the military forces are going to go back in size again. And so you get that in the ETO with the Second Rangers writing up their histories and amending it slightly, so the final version is helping to sell them as to the future. And you get the same with the British units, the commandos, the airborne forces. They're all doing as what they can to make sure they are part of the setup when the war ends. So well, that's, in the end, with the fact poor Rich Weiss couldn't join us yesterday because of family issues, this has been a perfect way to start off Iwo Jima week, because I think it's giving us that grounding of where it sits in the bigger picture. And then we can get on with Brian, Mark, Rigg tomorrow talking about the actual invasion itself and the flamethrowers and the tanks and the volcanic sand. And we can talk with Harlan about the tunnels and the island, and then go on with Marty and talk about the weapons on Saturday. Possibly we'll have a final show where we're going to be talking about the Japanese defenses in depth. But thank you very much for joining us, Ian. I've learned an incredible amount. People have enjoyed this a lot, I think. It's important to look at it in that bigger picture of a bigger campaign. And you have very ably and very simply, but I mean that in a complimentary way, broken down those two schools of thought about the Philippines route and the central route, and made it very understandable. So again, thank you very much, Ian, for joining us. And if we go back and do some of the earlier campaigns at some point in the future, we'd like you to come back and talk about something again, because the Iwo Jima is the big one, but there's lots more we can talk about as well. And incidentally, just one final question: is there a particular part of the Pacific campaign that is your favorite, quote unquote? I mean, I don't want to say in terms of like favorite places where people die, but is there a campaign that is the one you found the most fun in researching?
Well, I've really focused on the naval campaign. So if I had to single one part of this out, I would say it was really the first few months of the Fast Carrier Task Force. So really late 43 through early 44. When the new big carriers were just getting into action, and you had all these new toys suddenly appearing in the Pacific, these new airplanes, newly trained pilots. And as a result of that, the carrier task force commanders, Spruance and Mitscher, and the task group commanders, they all had to improvise to sort of figure out, what do we do with this very formidable new naval force that no one has ever seen before. And I found that to be absolutely fascinating. And I think I turned up a lot of good new information about it too.
Definitely. And it's something that's it's naturally harder to explain in the written word, because naval battles, it's flat oceans and it's hard. It's very abstract. I mean, we find in Normandy here, explaining the naval actions, pointing, well, over there was, but you can explain, see that hill there, we've got to get that hill. Ground operations have that ease of explanation that naval battles, you've got to be a very good writer to be able to make a naval battle sort of come alive, because it does just end up being coordinates and distances and compass bearings, which can be boring, but when it's told the right way, fascinating. And it's an area I've got to get into, because I've got to study my coral seas and my midways more, because I'm lacking knowledge there. So you can come back on and talk about that later on. So
yeah, there's a little bit of interesting naval history in the history of Great Britain as well, as you may have noticed.
A little bit. Yeah, no, we do. Yeah, Nelson kicking the French asses on a few occasions, in others. That's absolutely true. And and we can go and talk about that. So anyway, in terms of everybody watching, we've got 2 shows coming up tomorrow. So Harlan Glenn talking about the geography of Iwo Jima and all the things that can hurt you and bite you and kill you. And then Mark Rigg coming on talking about the invasion itself. But tonight was the explanation of where it sits in context. And Ian W. Toll has done an absolutely incredible job explaining that. So in terms of everybody watching, don't forget, check out our pages on Patreon. The links to Ian's official website is in the description below, where you can buy his books. I recommend the trilogy resoundingly. They are fantastic. Don't forget our sponsors, battlemaps.us, and of course check us out on Twitter and Facebook and all the usual. But this is Paul Woodadge and Ian W. Toll for World War II TV saying thank you very much. Have a good evening, and we will see you all again on World War II TV very shortly. Thank you, everybody.